All characters, locations, organizations, and events in this story are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Oh. She slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table like she was returning something she'd borrowed and no longer needed. I've already spoken to a lawyer, Celeste said, not quite meeting his eyes. Adrian and I are serious. This isn't something I decided overnight. Darius Munro looked at the papers. He looked at his wife of 15 years, the woman he had driven to every job interview, every networking dinner, every charity gala where she smiled at people whose names he could never keep straight. She was wearing the pearl earrings he'd bought her for their 10th anniversary. She hadn't taken them off yet. Adrian Cross, he said. The name sat in his mouth like a piece of metal. The real estate guy. He's more than that. I know what he is. Celeste finally looked at him then. That look she'd been perfecting for years, the one that mixed pity with something colder. Darius, you're a good man. I'm not saying you aren't, but I need more than good. I need someone who matches where I'm going. Adrian understands that world. He lives in it. Darius said nothing. He picked up his coffee mug, took a sip, set it back down. You're going to be fine, she said, almost gently. You've got the shop. The shop. 15 years of marriage, and that's what she knew. The shop. He didn't correct her. If you've ever felt unseen by the person who was supposed to know you best, stay with this story. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from because I want to know how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what Celeste didn't know about her husband was about to change everything. The Munro family had been in Detroit iron since before Darius was born. His grandfather, Curtis Munro, had started the first garage in 1971 in a building on Livernois Avenue with second-hand equipment, a second-hand lift, and a reputation for never cheating a customer. That reputation spread the way good reputations do in tight neighborhoods. Slowly, then all at once. By the time Curtis handed the business to his son Raymond in 1994, there were 2 locations. By the time Raymond handed it to Darius in 2009, there were 4. Darius had taken it to 7. He did not broadcast this. He did not put his face on billboards or give interviews to business journals. The Munro name was on the signs, and that was enough. He wore the same Navy coveralls his grandfather had worn, drove the same '94 F-150 his father had kept in near-perfect condition, and showed up at each location on a rotating schedule so that the people who worked for him knew he wasn't just a name on a paycheck. This was a choice, a considered one. Curtis Munro had told him once, when Darius was about 11 years old and more interested in the socket wrench than in anything his grandfather was saying, the day you start thinking the business owes you something, that's the day it starts dying. Darius had never forgotten it. What he hadn't anticipated, what no 11-year-old considers, was that the same principle, applied to a marriage, could leave you invisible in your own home. He had met Celeste at a fundraiser for a community arts program in 2008. She was working in nonprofit development then, sharp and energetic, the kind of woman who could work a room without appearing to work it. He'd been dragged there by his cousin Marcus, who had donated a free oil change to the silent auction and wanted to make sure the check cleared. Darius had spent most of that evening standing near the food table, slightly uncomfortable in a blazer he'd borrowed, when Celeste walked over and asked him, directly and without preamble, what he did for a living. He told her he worked in automotive. She'd nodded like that was interesting, like it was genuinely fine. My uncle was a mechanic, she said, best diagnostician in his county. People drove 2 hours to have him listen to their engine. He liked her immediately. They dated for a year. He proposed on a Tuesday, not a special occasion, because that's when he felt sure. Not when the occasion demanded it. She said yes. Her mother asked, once, in a way that wasn't exactly subtle, whether he had any ambitions beyond the garage. Darius had said he thought the garage would be enough. He wasn't wrong. He just hadn't been specific. The marriage had been good in the beginning. They were different in ways that worked. She brought home ideas, people, energy. He brought steadiness, a long memory, and the ability to fix anything mechanical that came within 10 feet of him. They didn't have children. That had been a conversation they'd had at year 3, and again at year 6, and by year 9 it was something they'd stopped bringing up. The distance had grown so gradually that Darius couldn't name a moment it started. It was more like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice until the handling goes wrong, and by then you've been driving on it for miles. Celeste had moved up in her career. She'd left nonprofit work and moved into corporate communications, then into PR consulting, and her clients were the kind of people who had skyboxes at sporting events and took meetings over meals that cost more than Darius spent on groceries in a month. She was good at it. He respected that genuinely, but somewhere in that climb she'd started assessing him through different eyes. He saw it at the dinner parties, the slight tension in her face when he talked about the shop, the smooth redirect she'd do when someone asked him too many follow-up questions. Once, at a fundraising gala for a hospital expansion, a man in a very good suit had asked Darius what he drove and seemed amused when Darius said a '94 Ford pickup. Celeste had laughed along. On the drive home, she said it had been charming. Darius didn't say anything, but he'd noticed the word she chose. Charming. Like something you'd describe a child doing. He'd known about Adrian Cross for about 4 months before Celeste brought up the divorce. He hadn't hired a detective. He hadn't needed to. Darius moved through Detroit in ways Celeste didn't fully track. He knew property managers, city council staffers, general contractors, restaurant owners. The city's business layer wasn't as large as it appeared from the outside, and people talked. A friend had mentioned, offhand, that he'd seen Celeste having lunch at a downtown hotel restaurant with Adrian Cross, and that they didn't look like they were discussing a business deal. Darius had filed that away without reacting. He'd looked Cross up after that. Not obsessively, just the way you'd inspect a piece of machinery you weren't sure about. Adrian Cross was 43, based in Chicago, had moved into Detroit real estate 3 years ago when the city's redevelopment money started flowing in earnest. He had a company called Cross Holdings Group, a polished website, and a visible presence at the kind of events Celeste now attended regularly. His model seemed to be identifying undervalued properties in transitional neighborhoods, securing them cheaply, and reselling or developing them once the surrounding investment drove values up. Nothing illegal in that by itself. Darius had noted a few things, though, and set them aside. The timing of Cross's Detroit expansion, the neighborhoods he was circling, and a conversation Darius had overheard, not intentionally, between Celeste and someone on the phone, in which she'd said, "He just doesn't pay attention to that stuff. I told you, he barely looks at the financials." He hadn't confronted her about it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he'd needed to understand the shape of the thing before he moved. The morning she put the divorce papers on the table, Darius had already been awake for 2 hours. He'd driven out to the Gratiot Avenue location at 5:30 to handle a delivery issue with a parts supplier. A miscommunication about a bulk order that had been sitting unresolved for 3 days. He'd sorted it out by 7, driven back through the city as it was waking up, stopped at the gas station on Fenkel that he'd been stopping at since he was 18, and bought a large black coffee in a styrofoam cup. He got home at 7:40. Celeste was already dressed, already composed, already positioned at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her. Prepared. That's what she was. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," she said. He sat across from her and listened to her lay it out. Her voice was careful. Not cruel, not apologetic, just careful. Like she'd rehearsed it enough times to take the shake out of it. She talked about needing more, about the life she'd worked toward, about Adrian understanding her in ways that, "You've been talking to him about the business," Darius said. She paused. "We talk about a lot of things. Specifically the business, Monroe Motor Works." Something shifted in her face, but only briefly. "I've mentioned it, yes. He's in real estate. Some of the properties came up." "Which properties?" "Darius?" "Which ones, Celeste?" She looked away. "The Livernois location. The one on Gratiot. Maybe the East Warren building. I don't remember exactly." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a garbage truck was making its way down their street. The sound of it, mechanical and familiar, filled the kitchen. "Okay," he said. She looked back at him. "That's it? Okay? I'm not going to beg you to stay." She seemed briefly like she'd expected something different, an argument, a breakdown, a scene. "I think this can be handled maturely," she said. "The lawyers can... I'll call my lawyer this week." Celeste nodded. She straightened the papers, slid them back toward herself, stood up. She was wearing heels already. At 8 in the morning, she'd been ready for this for a long time. At the doorway, she paused. "I know this is hard," she said. "I really do. But you'll be okay, Darius. You've got the shop." He watched her go. the shop. Well, Marcus Munro was 2 years younger than Darius, built like a refrigerator, and had been the company's head of operations since 2015. He was also the only person Darius talked to about anything that actually mattered. They met for lunch at a Coney Island on McNichols, vinyl booths, coffee that had been sitting since the morning, the smell of grease and onions that Darius associated more with comfort than with any particularly good meal. Darius laid out what had happened. Not in order, he wasn't the kind of man who told stories in a clean sequence, but in pieces, the way you might spread parts across a workbench before you start diagnosing. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When Darius finished, Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and said, "She told him about the properties. 3 of them at least, maybe more. And you think Cross knew what he was looking at?" "I think Cross knew exactly what he was looking at." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Darius looked out the window. A couple walking a dog. A bus idling at the corner. A city that had been broken apart and was slowly, stubbornly putting itself back together. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but with intention. "I want to understand what he's actually after," Darius said, "before I do anything." "And Celeste?" He looked back at his cousin. "She's already made her decision." "That's not what I asked." Darius picked up his coffee, set it down. "Yeah," he said. "I know. What?" "I went back to the Livernois shop that afternoon. It wasn't the flagship. There was no flagship. He didn't think in those terms. But it was the original. The building his grandfather had started in, though the structure had been expanded twice since then, and the equipment was all updated. The sign was the same design, though. A dark navy background, white lettering, Monroe Motorworks, S 1971. He walked the floor for an hour, talking to the techs, checking in with the service manager, a woman named Gloria, who had been with the company for 11 years and knew every vehicle in the city by the sound it made. He wasn't there to work. He was there because the shop steadied him in a way nothing else quite did. The smell of it, the noise, the fact that problems in here had solutions, and you could see them. Toward the end of his walkthrough, he stopped at the bulletin board near the break room. There were the usual things: a parts schedule, a safety notice, a flyer for somebody's church fish fry. And there was something new: a photocopy of a business card, pinned near the top, with a handwritten note beneath it that read, "This guy came in asking about the building lease. Told him I didn't know anything. T." The business card read, "Cross Holdings Group. Adrian Cross, Principal." Darius unpinned the card and stood there holding it for a moment. He came here. He wasn't just circling the properties from the outside. He'd walked in the front door. Darius folded the business card and put it in his pocket. He went back out to the floor, finished his rounds, thanked Gloria, and drove home in the F-150 as the November sky went dark and orange over the city. In the driveway, he sat in the truck for a long time. I thought about his grandfather, who had built something real out of nothing and never once let it make him loud. He thought about his father, who'd kept the thing alive through years when Detroit's auto industry was contracting like a wounded animal. He thought about every decision he'd made in the last 15 years. The expansions, the properties purchased when nobody wanted them, the employees he'd kept on during the slow seasons because letting people go had felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't fully name. He thought about Celeste saying you've got the shop like it was a consolation prize. Then he got out of the truck and went inside, and he sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and he started writing down everything he knew about Adrian Cross. It wasn't anger that drove him. Or not only anger, it was something older and steadier. The same thing that made his grandfather show up before sunrise every morning for 30 years. The recognition that something he'd built was being moved against, and that he was not going to let that happen quietly. The legal pad filled up faster than Darius expected. He wasn't a man who kept journals or made lists for the sake of making lists. His grandfather had run the business mostly from memory and a single spiral notebook he kept in the breast pocket of his coveralls. Darius had modernized the operation, accounting software, digital inventory, a proper HR system, but his instinct was still analog when it mattered. When something needed to be understood, he put it on paper. By 10 o'clock that night, he had 2 full pages. Adrian Cross had incorporated Cross Holdings Group in Illinois 4 years ago. Before that, he'd operated under a different entity name in the Indianapolis market, where he'd done 3 deals in 2 years and then quietly dissolved the company. Darius had found this through a contact who did commercial title work, a woman named Petra, who had the memory of a court recorder and charged accordingly for it. He'd called her from the kitchen while the heat kicked on and rattled the old pipes, and she'd talked for 20 minutes while he wrote. The Indianapolis thing wasn't a scandal, Petra said. Nothing got filed, no judgments. But two of those sellers ended up in disputes with him afterward about what they'd actually agreed to. One settled quietly. The other one just stopped. I don't know if he got paid off or got tired. What kind of properties? Mixed use? Transitional neighborhoods? Same playbook he's running in Detroit from what I can tell. Darius underlined the word playbook on his pad. He comes into a market, identifies properties that are undervalued but have redevelopment potential, and then he finds ways to make them more available, Petra said, whether the owners want them to be or not. After he hung up, he sat at the table and looked at what he'd written. Cross had shown up in Detroit at almost exactly the moment Darius's expansion into the East Warren corridor had become visible. The new Monroe location on East Warren had opened 14 months ago. It was in a block that had been largely vacant for years. Darius had bought the building and two adjacent lots in 2019 for less than most people would spend on a new car, because nobody else wanted them. The neighborhood had been distressed, the kind of place where city maps showed more parking lots and boarded windows than active businesses. That was changing. Slowly, the way Detroit changed, not in press releases, but in the quiet decisions of people who had reasons to stay. A bakery had opened 2 doors down. A barber shop. A woman who made custom furniture out of reclaimed wood had taken the corner unit. Darius's garage had been part of that, not by design exactly, but because putting a functioning business in a block tends to pull other functioning businesses toward it. And now Adrian Cross was circling, the business card from the Liver Noir shop, the questions about the lease, the way Celeste had mentioned properties, not 1, but 3, in what she'd framed as casual conversation. Darius stared at the ceiling for a moment. She didn't know what she was doing. That was his first thought, and he held onto it carefully, turned it over. Celeste was intelligent. She was strategically minded in her own domain. But she'd never been involved in the property side of Monroe Motorworks. She'd never asked, and he'd never pushed it on her. To her, the business was a garage. Several garages. Something that paid the bills and occasionally required him to spend his evenings on phone calls she found boring. She wouldn't have known what Adrian was listening for. She wouldn't have known which information was worth anything. That thought made him feel something complicated, not exactly sympathy, but something adjacent to it, something that sat alongside his anger without fully displacing it. He folded the legal pad and went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did when there was a problem he hadn't solved yet. The next morning, he called his attorney. Diane Okafor had handled Monroe Motorworks legal work for 8 years. She was methodical, not given to drama, and had a habit of asking the same question 3 different ways until she was sure she understood what you actually meant, rather than what you'd said. Darius had always appreciated that. It cost him in billable hours, but saved him in misunderstandings. He told her about the divorce, about Celeste, about Adrian Cross and the properties and what Petra had told him about the Indianapolis situation. He told her about the business card pinned to the bulletin board at Liver Noir. Diane listened without interrupting, which meant she was either very interested or very concerned. Usually, it was both. "Has Celeste had access to any formal business documents?" she asked when he finished. "Financials, property records, anything with the LLC structure?" "She wasn't involved in operations. But we have a shared home office. I keep physical copies of the annual reports there, the property portfolios." Did she know what those documents represented? Darius thought about it. I don't know how much she understood. She knew the properties existed. I don't think she understood the full picture of what they're worth. Okay. A pause. Darius, if Cross has been gathering information through Celeste, even if she didn't know she was providing it, that's a material concern. Especially if he's attempting to use that information to acquire assets during a period when you're going to be engaged in divorce proceedings. That's what I'm worried about. You need to get your financial documents in order and secured, everything. And you need to bring in someone to look at whether Cross or anyone connected to him has made any formal or informal inquiries about the properties. Title searches, option letters, anything. I'll call Petra. Good. And Darius, don't sign anything related to the divorce until I've reviewed it. I wasn't planning to. I know, she said. I'm telling you anyway because people in difficult personal situations sometimes do things they weren't planning to do. He appreciated the honesty, even if it stung a little. He spent the next 3 days doing something he rarely did. He stayed off the shop floor and stayed at his desk. The desk was in the back office of the East Warren location, a room that was functionally ugly, institutional carpet, a particle board desk he'd inherited from the previous tenant, a whiteboard with scheduling information that was always slightly out of date. But it had a door that closed, and it had everything he needed: his laptop, a file cabinet with hard copies of the key documents, and a phone with enough signal to make calls without having to walk outside. He pulled the full property portfolio. Monroe Motor Works owned, directly or through its subsidiary LLCs, 9 properties in Detroit. 7 were the operational locations. 2 were adjacent parcels that Darius had acquired speculatively, one next to the East Warren shop, one near the Gratiot location, because he'd had a feeling the land would matter eventually, and he'd learned to trust that feeling. Total assessed value, a little over $22 million on paper, but assessed value in Detroit was a moving target. The actual market value, what those properties would fetch from the right buyer in the current redevelopment climate, was something he hadn't formally appraised in over a year. When he called a commercial real estate contact and ran some rough numbers, the figure that came back was closer to $28 million, maybe 30, for a buyer who understood what they were looking at. He sat with that number for a moment. Then he called Marcus. "I need you to pull the last 18 months of inquiry logs," he said. "Any outside contact about leases, sales, option agreements, anything property-related that came in through the shops." "That's not all centralized," Marcus said. "Some of that goes through the individual location managers." "Then talk to the managers, quietly. I don't want this to feel like an audit." "What am I looking for specifically?" "Adrian Cross, Cross Holdings Group. Any name you don't recognize asking questions that feel like they're about the land rather than the service bays." Marcus was quiet for a second. "Darius, how bad is this?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need the logs." What Marcus found, over the following week, was worse than Darius had expected, and not as bad as he'd feared, which was the kind of result that didn't actually make you feel better. At 3 locations, Livernois, Gratiot, and East Warren, there had been inquiries in the past 8 months from parties who weren't identifiable as existing customers or vendors. At Livernois, someone had called the main line asking about the lease structure and who held the property title. The service manager had told them she didn't handle that and hadn't followed up. At Gratiot, a man who didn't leave a name had come in asking about the building's history and whether the owner had ever considered selling. The tech who'd been at the front desk had told him the owner wasn't interested and left it at that. At East Warren, the inquiry had been more specific. A written letter sent to the shop's address, on Cross Holdings Group letterhead, expressing interest in discussing potential development opportunities for the property and the adjacent parcels. The letter was dated 4 months ago. It had been received by the location manager, a man named Jerome, who had been with the company for 6 years, and who had, on his own judgment, filed it away without responding and without alerting anyone above him because, as he told Marcus, "I figured if Mr. Monroe wanted to sell, he would have said something." Jerome's instinct had been right. His execution had left a gap. Darius didn't blame him. That wasn't a productive use of his energy. What he focused on instead was the timeline. The letter was dated 4 months ago. That was approximately when Celeste had first mentioned Adrian's name in passing at home. The first time Darius had heard it, mentioned briefly in the context of a charity event she'd attended. He'd been half listening. He remembered the name only because he'd heard it again, later. The letter predated that mention, which meant Cross had already identified the Monroe properties as targets before he deepened his connection to Celeste. Or, and this was the part that sat heavy, he had identified them through Celeste before the letter was sent. Darius needed to understand that sequence. He needed to understand exactly when Cross and Celeste had met, and how early in that relationship the properties had come up. He wasn't going to get that from Celeste directly. Not now, with lawyers involved, and her clearly committed to her version of events. But he knew someone who might be able to help him without either of them having to have that conversation. Her name was Deb Fontaine. She and Celeste had been close friends for years, the kind of friendship that survived career changes and moves, and the general attrition that cuts through adult friendships like a slow-moving flood. Deb was a grants administrator at a cultural foundation, lived in Midtown, and had, on multiple occasions, demonstrated the particular skill of knowing more than she let on. Darius called her on a Thursday evening, not because he'd planned to, but because he was driving past her neighborhood, and the thought arrived fully formed. She picked up on the third ring. He could hear cooking sounds in the background. Darius. Not surprised exactly. Careful. Hey, Deb. Deb, I'm not calling to put you in the middle of anything. Mm-hmm. I just have one question. You don't have to answer it. A pause. Okay. When did Celeste first mention Adrian Cross to you? Not to me. To you. The cooking sounds stopped. She must have turned off the burner. Why does that matter? She said. It might not. I'm trying to understand a timeline. Another pause. Longer this time. Darius, I like you. I've always liked you. And I told Celeste a long time ago that what she was doing wasn't right. Not the way she was doing it. I want you to know that. I know. When did she mention him? About a year ago, Deb said quietly. Maybe a little more. She said she'd met this developer at a charity thing and that he was interesting, smart, that he asked a lot of questions about the city, about neighborhoods, about which businesses had been around long enough to own their buildings. Darius said nothing. I didn't think anything of it at the time, Deb continued. It sounded like business talk. But then a few months later she mentioned him again, and the way she talked about him had changed. And I said, Darius, I said to her, Celeste, are you sure about this? And she said she'd never felt like anyone really saw her potential before, like Adrian actually understood what she was capable of. And she was still talking about me when she said that? She was talking about her life, the way her life had been. He drove in silence for a block. The questions he was asking, Darius said, about neighborhoods, about businesses that owned buildings. Did she describe them in more detail? Did she say she'd answered them? Deb made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. She talked about Monroe Motorworks, Darius. She talked about the Livernois building. She said he'd asked how long the company had been in those locations, and she'd said forever, practically. She thought it was just... Deb stopped. She thought it was just conversation. Okay. Is he trying to do something to the business? I'm figuring that out, Darius said. Deb, thank you. I'm sorry, she said, for what it's worth. It's worth something, he said, and meant it. Deb. He met with Diane again the following week, this time in her office with Marcus present and a set of documents spread across the conference table. Diane had her own people looking at Cross Holdings' Detroit activity now, and what they'd assembled was a picture that had a logic to it once you knew what you were looking at. Cross's strategy, as best as they could reconstruct it, worked in stages. First, he identified properties, typically in improving neighborhoods, typically held by long-term owners who either weren't aware of their current market value or weren't financially pressured enough to sell. Then he made soft inquiries, usually through third parties or by leveraging personal connections, to assess the owner's appetite for a transaction. If the owner showed no interest, he looked for pressure points, financial difficulties, partnership disputes, regulatory issues, anything that might change that calculus. If none of those existed naturally, there was evidence, in at least one prior deal, that he'd helped create them. What kind of help? Darius asked. Diane set a paper in front of him. One of the Indianapolis properties. The owner was a family business, heating and cooling company, had operated out of the building for 20 years. In the 18 months before they sold to Cross, they lost 3 senior technicians to a competing company that Cross had a quiet financial relationship with. They also had a city inspection that flagged some code issues that were subsequently challenged by the owner as having been reported incorrectly, but by then the remediation costs had strained their operating budget. He bled them. That's one way to say it. Marcus had his arms crossed and was staring at the table. I was already doing this to us, he said, asking questions about the leases, showing up at the shops. If we hadn't caught it, we caught it, Darius said. What concerns me more, Diane said, and her voice was measured in the way that meant what followed was the actual problem, is this. She slid another document forward. It was a photocopy, slightly degraded, like it had been scanned from a printed copy rather than from an original file. This came to me through a source I'm not going to name right now. It appears to be an internal memo from Cross Holdings. It outlines their acquisition strategy for what they're calling the Monroe Cluster. Their words, not mine. Darius picked it up. The document was 4 pages. The first 2 pages were an assessment of the Monroe Motorworks properties, their locations, approximate values, their current use, and what Cross Holdings projected they could yield under redevelopment. The numbers were close to what Darius's own informal appraisal had suggested. Whoever had written this document had done their homework. The 3rd page was where it got specific. Under a heading that read, Operational Disruption Pathway, the memo outlined a sequence. Identify and approach key technical staff at Monroe locations with competitive employment offers. Increase cost pressure on the company by triggering a regulatory review of 2 properties with potential zoning ambiguities. And, if the owner remained resistant, pursue acquisition through a financial partner who could offer a distressed asset purchase at a fraction of market value. There was a name attached to the regulatory review item, a city official whose department handled commercial zoning compliance. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, half of a sentence, cut off by what looked like a missing 4th page. Given the access we have through... That was where it ended. Darius set the document down. Where's the rest of it? Marcus asked. The source only had 3 pages, Diane said. The 4th is missing. Darius looked at the cut sentence for a long moment. Given the access we have through Celeste. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. This document, he said, is it enough to take somewhere? Possibly, but we need to establish who produced it and confirm its authenticity before we do anything with it officially. Diane tapped the table with one finger. What I want to know right now is whether Cross has already moved on any part of this. The regulatory piece specifically. Marcus pulled out his phone. I can make some calls. I know people in the zoning office. Be careful how you ask, Diane said. If there's already a review in motion, we don't want to tip anyone that we're aware of it. Marcus nodded and stepped out of the room. Diane looked at Darius across the table. She had a particular expression she sometimes wore. Not quite sympathy, more like the look of someone who's seen a version of this situation before and knows the part that comes next tends to be the hardest. How are you doing with all of this? She asked. Not the legal question, the other thing. Darius was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about how much she must have told him, he said, not because she was trying to hurt the company, because she didn't think the company was worth protecting. She thought it was just a garage. And that's worse somehow. Yeah, he said, it is. He picked up the 3-page memo and looked at the cut sentence again. Given the access we have through, there was a 4th page somewhere, either in Cross's office or in someone's file, or possibly already acted upon. The sentence finished somewhere, and what it said when it finished was going to matter. Darius folded the document carefully and set it in front of Diane. Find out what's on that 4th page, he said. Whatever it costs. She nodded once. I'll find it. Outside the office window, Detroit was doing what it always did in November. Going gray and cold and stubborn. The kind of weather that didn't ask you how you felt about it. Darius had lived in this city his whole life. He knew that the things that survived Detroit winters were the things that had roots deep enough to hold. He wasn't going anywhere. The 4th page arrived on a Tuesday. Diane called him at 6:40 in the morning, which told him everything about how she felt about what she'd found before she said a single word about it. Diane Okafor did not make calls before 7 unless the situation required it. I need you to come in, she said. Today? This morning. Bring Marcus. He was at her office by 8:15. Marcus got there 5 minutes later, still in his work jacket, carrying 2 coffees from the gas station on Finkel, because that was what Marcus did when he didn't know what else to do. He brought coffee, and he showed up. Diane had the document on the table when they walked in. All 4 pages this time, the original 3 plus the recovered 4th, separated by a paperclip. She'd set it in the center of the table like something that needed to be approached carefully. She let them read it before she said anything. The 4th page was 6 paragraphs. The first 2 completed the sentence that had been cut off on page 3. Given the access we have through our relationship with CM, we are positioned to move on the Monroe cluster within the current fiscal quarter, contingent on finalizing the authorization document, CM Celeste Monroe. Her initials, in a strategy memo from a man she believed was her future. Darius read it twice. He kept his face still. It was something he'd learned from his father. Not suppression exactly, more like a decision about where you put the feeling while you figure out what to do with it. The third paragraph was the one that changed everything. It described a document, referred to in the memo as the authorization instrument, that would formalize Celeste's purported agreement to allow Cross Holdings to negotiate directly with Monroe Motorworks lender on behalf of the property portfolio. The memo stated that the document had been prepared and executed, using language that implied a signature had already been obtained or would be obtained through means the memo described as a presentation of the matter in terms she would find favorable. In plain terms, Adrian Cross had either already forged Celeste's signature on a document authorizing him to deal with Darius's lender, or he was planning to. "When was this memo written?" Marcus asked. 6 weeks ago, Diane said. Marcus set down his coffee. "So he's already moving." "That's what I think, yes." Darius looked up from the document. "Has he made contact with the lender?" "That's what I've been trying to establish since last night." Diane opened a folder. "First Midwest Commercial. They hold the note on the East Warren property and the 2 adjacent parcels. I have a contact there. Off the record, she told me that a representative from Cross Holdings made an inquiry approximately 3 weeks ago, presenting what they described as a letter of authorization from the property owner's spouse." The room was quiet enough that Darius could hear the heat vent ticking. "They accepted the inquiry?" he asked. "They didn't reject it. They opened a preliminary file. Nothing has been formalized, but if Cross moves forward with a purchase offer backed by that authorization document, the lender would have an obligation to at least consider it, especially if the offer included an assumption of the existing loan, which would make it look like a cooperative transaction," Darius said. "From the outside, yes." Marcus had his hands pressed flat on the table. "Celeste doesn't know about any of this." It wasn't a question, but Diane answered it anyway. "Based on everything we can see, no. The memo's language about presenting the matter in favorable terms suggests she was told something. Probably that signing gave Cross the ability to explore refinancing options that would benefit her in the divorce settlement. Something that sounded like it was in her interest." "He used her," Marcus said. "He absolutely used her," Diane said. "And that is going to matter, legally and practically, in terms of how we proceed." Darius had been quiet for a moment. He was still looking at the initials on the page. CM, his wife's initials, reduced to 2 letters in someone else's acquisition strategy. "I want to see her," he said. Diane looked at him carefully. "Darius, not to fight, not to make a scene. I need her to understand what she's caught up in before this goes any further, because if Cross uses that document and it gets challenged, her name is on it, her credibility is on it. The divorce proceedings could get tied up in a fraud investigation that has nothing to do with the marriage itself. I'd recommend your lawyers are present for any conversation with Celeste at this point." "I know what you'd recommend." He looked at her directly. "I'm going to talk to my wife." Diane held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, once, slowly, the way she did when she'd decided that arguing further wasn't going to change anything. "Tell me what she says," she said. He called Celeste that afternoon from the parking lot of the East Warren shop. She picked up on the 4th ring, which meant she'd thought about not picking up and then decided she should. "Darius," guarded, "I need to talk to you. In person. Not about the divorce. About something that involves you directly and that you need to know about." A pause. "Is this a lawyer thing?" "Not yet. Right now it's just a conversation." "I don't think it's a good idea for us to—" "Celeste." He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking you to reconsider anything. I'm telling you that someone has put your name on a document you didn't understand and that it's going to cause you serious problems if we don't address it." Silence. Then, "What kind of document?" "The kind I'd rather explain in person." She agreed to meet him the following evening at the house. Their house still, technically, until the lawyers sorted out the rest. She was staying with a friend in Midtown. Darius was still in the house, which felt odd in the particular way that familiar spaces feel odd when you're suddenly alone in them. He spent the night before the meeting laying out what he was going to say and what he wasn't. He wasn't going to use the word fraud right away. He wasn't going to lead with what he knew about Cross and Celeste's relationship. He was going to show her the document and let her read it, because in his experience, the most effective thing you could do with someone who had convinced themselves of a particular version of events was to hand them something in writing and let them confront it without you narrating it for them. He also decided, in that quiet house with the pipes ticking and the neighbor's dog barking at something in the alley, to do the other thing, the thing he'd been sitting on for 15 years. She arrived at 7. She rang the doorbell of her own house, which struck him as both thoughtful and slightly heartbreaking. He opened the door. She was dressed well. She was always dressed well. And she had the careful composure of someone who had prepared for a difficult conversation. He'd seen that composure before. He recognized now that he'd sometimes mistaken it for coldness when it was actually armor. "Come in," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table. He'd made coffee. She didn't take any. He didn't push it. "Before I show you what I need to show you," he said, "I want to do something first." She looked at him warily. "What?" He got up and went to this hallway closet, the one they'd mostly used for coats, and the vacuum cleaner, and the things that didn't have a home anywhere else. On the top shelf, behind a box of winter gloves, he'd placed an envelope that morning. He took it down and came back to the table. He set the envelope in front of her. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." She did. Inside were 7 keys, each on a separate ring, each with a small tag attached. She spread them on the table and looked at the tags. Addresses, each one. Livernois, Graciot, East Warren, 4 others. "Those are the locations," he said. "Each key is for the main building, not the key the manager has, the original key, the owner's key." He paused. "I own Monroe Motorworks, Celeste, not as an employee, as the owner, 74% of the company, directly and through 3 subsidiary LLCs. The properties themselves are worth somewhere between $28 and $30 million at current market value." She was looking at the keys, not at him. "I know you thought I was a mechanic who worked at a garage," he said. "I let you think that. That's on me. I was never good at talking about what the business was, because to me it was never about what it was worth. It was about what it was." He stopped himself. He wasn't going to make this a speech. "But you needed to know. You should have known a long time ago. That's something I got wrong." She picked up one of the keys, the East Warren one, turned it over in her fingers. $30 million, she said. Her voice was flat in a way that meant she was working through something. "Approximately. I don't say that to... Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question. It deserved an honest answer. Because the business was separate from the marriage in my head, and because... He paused. This was the harder part. Because you'd already started treating the garage like it was something to be embarrassed about. And I think I was afraid that if I told you what it actually was, you'd only stay because of what it was worth, and I didn't want that. She set the key down. She was quiet for a long moment. "That's a terrible reason," she said finally. "I know. You decided for me. You decided I couldn't handle knowing." "Yes. That's..." She stopped. He watched her face move through something complicated. "That's not completely wrong," she said, finally, quietly, in a way that sounded like it cost her something. They sat with that for a moment. Then Darius picked up the 3-page memo and the 4th page and set them in front of her. "Now I need you to read this," he said. "Take your time." He watched her read it. He could track her progress through the pages by the changes in her expression, the initial blankness of someone processing new information, the slight furrow when she hit the property valuations, the stillness that came over her face when she reached the 3rd page, and the phrase, "our relationship with CM." She turned to the 4th page. Read the paragraph about the authorization instrument. Read the phrase, "presented in terms she would find favorable." She put the document down. She didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Darius didn't fill the silence. "He told me," she said finally, "that there was a refinancing opportunity. That if I signed a letter of consent, it would establish my independent financial interest in the property as part of the divorce proceedings. That it was standard practice. That my lawyer should review it, but that it was time-sensitive." "Did your lawyer review it?" She looked at him. The composure was gone. What was underneath it wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was something rawer than that. "I hadn't gotten around to sending it to her yet." "The document has already been presented to the lender, Celeste, 3 weeks ago, as an authorization from you." "I didn't. I signed a consent form. He said it was to establish my interest in..." She stopped. She put her hand flat on the fourth page of the memo, on the sentence about favorable terms. He wrote this. Yes. He knew what he was doing when he asked me to sign it. Yes. She pulled her hand back from the paper. She was looking at the keys again, the 7 of them, spread across the kitchen table, each one tagged with an address. 7 buildings. $30 million. A man she'd lived with for 15 years who had never once told her what he was actually carrying. I have to call my lawyer, she said. You should. Tonight. Yes. She stood up. She was moving the way people move when they're holding themselves together through the specific effort of keeping their body doing the next practical thing. Darius recognized it. He'd been doing it for 2 weeks. She picked up her bag. At the doorway to the kitchen, she stopped. The things you said, she said, without turning around. About giving things up. About why you didn't tell me. She paused. Were there things? Actually, that you gave up? He thought about the question carefully because she deserved a careful answer and not a convenient one. There was an offer from a private equity group in 2014. They wanted to buy 50% of the company and take it national. It would have been a significant payout. I turned it down because you had just taken the job at Halloran Communications and we just moved into this house, and I didn't want to blow up the stability we'd built. He paused. There were a couple of other things. Nothing dramatic. She nodded slowly. She still wasn't facing him. I didn't know any of that, she said. No. You should have told me. I know. She left. He heard the front door close. Not slammed, just closed, the soft mechanical click of a latch catching. He sat at the kitchen table for a while, looking at the keys and the document and his cold coffee. He didn't feel the satisfaction he might have expected from having finally said the true thing. He felt tired in a way that sleep didn't really address. He felt the particular weight of having been right about something in a way that hadn't saved anything. Celeste called her attorney that night. Her attorney called Diane the next morning. The conversation that followed, which Diane relayed to Darius in a precise summary that took about 12 minutes and required him to sit down, was this. Celeste's attorney had reviewed the consent document Cross had asked her to sign. The language in the document, obscured by legal boilerplate and a deliberately confusing structure, did not merely establish Celeste's independent interest in the Monroe properties. It purported to grant Cross Holdings the right to negotiate a direct sale of 3 Monroe Motorworks properties with the lender, at a price Cross Holdings would propose, with Celeste listed as an authorized representative of the ownership group. She was not an authorized representative of the ownership group. She had never been. She was a spouse, not a business partner, and the LLC structure that held the properties was entirely in Darius's name, which meant the document was not just misleading, it was fraudulent. Her attorney is preparing a formal withdrawal and notice of unauthorized representation, Diane said. They're going to contact First Midwest Commercial directly. Good. Celeste is also prepared to provide a sworn statement that she did not knowingly authorize any transaction regarding Monroe Motorworks property and that the document was presented to her under false pretenses. Darius was quiet for a moment. Is she going to be okay? Legally. Her attorney believes so. She was deceived, not complicit. The question is whether Cross can argue otherwise. Diane paused. Darius, he's going to fight this. When he realizes the lender has been contacted and the authorization has been withdrawn, he is going to move fast, and he is going to come at this from multiple directions. I know. He may try to reframe the narrative, make it look like a legitimate business arrangement that went sideways. He'll need Celeste to stay quiet or stay confused. She's not going to do either, Darius said. He was more certain of this than he expected to be. Whatever else had broken between them, whatever distance and disappointment and accumulated small failures had turned their marriage into something unlivable. Celeste Monroe was not a woman who stayed confused once she understood she'd been made to be. There's one more thing, Diane said. Say it. The CFO at Cross Holdings. Her name is Nadia Mercer. She's been with Cross for about 4 years. My contact who recovered the 4th page of the memo. She got it from someone inside Cross Holdings. And the inside source is Mercer. Darius straightened slightly. Why? Apparently there's a dispute about how Cross has been handling the company's finances. Mercer signed off on some filings that she's now questioning. She's worried about her own liability. Diane paused. She has documents, Darius. Not just the memo. Transaction records, correspondence, a draft of the authorization instrument that shows Cross's alterations to the original consent form, including what the document looked like before he modified it and what it looked like after. She can prove he changed it. She can prove he changed it. Darius sat back. Outside the office window, the November sky was doing something unusual. There was a break in the clouds, a strip of pale winter light crossing the rooftops. It wouldn't last. It never did in November. But it was there for a moment, real and unexpected. Can we meet with her? He asked. I'm working on it. She's cautious. She wants certain protections before she'll talk formally. Offer her whatever's reasonable. I will. Diane was already writing something. One question, Darius. When this is resolved, and I believe it will be resolved in your favor, what do you want the outcome to look like? Not just the legal outcome, the actual outcome. He thought about it. He thought about Curtis Monroe in his coveralls, opening up the Livernois garage before sunrise because that was what you did when something was yours and you believed in it. He thought about the 7 keys on this kitchen table and the look on Celeste's face when she'd understood what they meant, and the way she'd asked whether there were things he'd given up. He thought about Adrian Cross, who had looked at everything Darius had quietly built and seen only a transaction. I want the business intact, he said. I want the people who work for me intact, and I want Adrian Cross to understand specifically and clearly that what he tried to take from me was never available. Diane nodded. She didn't add anything to that. Sometimes the clearest statements of intent didn't need a response. He picked up his jacket and left the office and walked to his truck in the parking structure below the building. He sat in the F-150 for a moment, the truck his father had maintained with the same attention he'd given everything that mattered to him. And he put his hands on the wheel and he breathed. He wasn't angry the way he'd expected to be. The anger was there, but it had settled into something more functional, less consuming. It had become, in the way of things that have been held long enough, a kind of clarity. He started the truck and drove out into the city, which was gray and cold and stubbornly, defiantly alive, the same as it had always been. There was still work to do. Nadia Mercer was not what Darius had expected. He'd built a picture of her in his head from the fragments Diane had given him, a CFO who'd signed off on questionable filings, who was now worried about her own exposure, who'd leaked documents through a back channel because she needed a way out. He'd expected someone calculating, someone who'd weighed her options and chosen the one that cost her the least. What he got instead was a woman in her mid-40s who arrived at Diane's office 12 minutes late because, as she explained without apology, she'd had to park 3 blocks away and she'd worn the wrong shoes for the distance. She had a leather portfolio under one arm and the specific exhaustion of someone who hadn't been sleeping well for a sustained period of time. She shook Darius's hand and sat down and said, "Before we start, I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this because I'm a good person. I'm doing this because Adrian altered documents I signed. And if this deal collapses the way I think it's going to, I am not going down with it." "That's honest," Darius said. "I found that honesty is faster," she said. He decided in that moment that he respected her. Diane had arranged the meeting carefully. Present were Darius, Marcus, Diane, and Diane's associate, a younger attorney named Will, who took notes with the focused silence of someone trying to prove something. Nadia had come alone, which itself said something about her situation inside Cross Holdings. She laid the portfolio on the table and opened it. "I've been Adrian's CFO for 4 years," she said. "In that time, I've seen 3 deals that had elements I was uncomfortable with. I flagged 2 of them internally." He addressed them on paper without actually changing what he was doing, which is a skill he has. She slid a document across the table. "This is the original consent form that was presented to your wife for signature. This is what it said before Adrian modified it." Darius looked at it. The document was a single page, a straightforward consent letter, the kind that acknowledged a spouse's awareness of a pending financial matter. It was the kind of thing a lawyer might ask for as a formality in a divorce proceeding involving business assets. "And this," Nadia said, sliding a second document forward, "is what it became after he made his changes." The second document was 3 pages. The language was buried in subordinate clauses and defined terms that ran to a separate exhibit. But the effect, once Diane's associate read it aloud and translated the construction, was clear. The document is modified, granted cross-holdings negotiating authority over the Monroe properties with First Midwest Commercial, positioned Celeste as an authorized agent of the ownership structure, and included a provision that any sale executed under the authorization would be binding on the underlying property regardless of subsequent ownership disputes. He added the exhibit after she signed the first page, Nadia said. The signature page itself wasn't changed, just everything it now referred to. Marcus leaned forward. He gave her the signature page separately. Correct. She signed what appeared to be a one-page form. He attached it to a three-page agreement she never saw. The room was quiet for a moment. How do you know this? Diane asked. Not skeptically, methodically. Because I have both versions in the document management system. The original was uploaded on a Tuesday. The modified version was uploaded 4 days later under the same file name, but the metadata shows a different creation timestamp. I flagged it to our document administrator, who came to me because she didn't know what to do with it. I told her I'd handle it. Nadia paused. I should have gone to a lawyer then. I waited 3 weeks instead, which I'm not proud of. Why did you wait? Darius asked. She looked at him directly. Because I'd been with the company 4 years. Because I own a small equity stake. Because I told myself there might be an explanation. She paused. There wasn't. Diane had been reviewing the metadata documentation while Nadia spoke. She looked up. This is sufficient to establish that the document was altered post-signature. Combined with the withdrawn authorization from Mrs. Monroe's attorney and the memo we already have, we have a coherent record of the fraud. There's more, Nadia said. She pulled a second folder from the portfolio. The loan Adrian is using to fund the Monroe acquisition, a $17 million construction and acquisition loan from a private lender called Bridgepoint Capital, is collateralized in part by properties he doesn't fully own. 2 of the 3 properties he listed as collateral are either under dispute from prior transactions or were pledged to a different lender in an earlier deal. She set the folder down. He built a $17 million loan on a foundation that will not hold once anyone looks at it carefully. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He was going to buy our properties with money he borrowed against properties he didn't actually have. Essentially, yes. Darius sat back. I was processing not just the mechanics of what he was hearing, but the scope of it, the degree to which Cross's entire move had depended on things staying in place just long enough. Celeste not looking too closely at what she'd signed. The lender not running a deep title check before the deal closed. The Monroe properties not having an owner who paid attention. Every part of the plan had required Darius to be exactly what Celeste had always believed he was. An ordinary man with a garage who didn't track the numbers, who'd be caught off guard by the speed of it, who'd be too busy being heartbroken about his marriage to notice what was happening to his business. What does Cross think is happening right now? Darius asked Nadia. He thinks the deal is on track. As of yesterday morning, he hadn't been notified by First Midwest that the authorization had been questioned. She paused. That may change today. Darius looked at Diane. I contacted First Midwest this morning, Diane said. They're reviewing the withdrawal of authorization from Mrs. Monroe's attorney. They've put the preliminary file on hold pending clarification. How long before Cross finds out? It depends on whether he has a contact at the bank. Could be today, could be tomorrow. Darius thought for a moment. Then he said, I want to talk to him. Everyone looked at him. Darius, Diane said carefully. Not here. Not through lawyers. I want to sit across from him. He kept his voice even. Before this becomes a formal legal proceeding, before he has time to prepare a public narrative, I want him to know what I know, directly. That is not standard practice, Diane said. I'm aware. He could use anything you say. He's not going to use anything I say, Darius said, because I'm not going to give him anything usable. I'm going to give him a choice. He looked at Nadia. Can you get me a meeting? Nadia studied him for a moment. She had the expression of someone recalibrating. I can tell him you want to discuss a potential resolution to the authorization dispute before it escalates. He'll think he can still manage it. Good. Let him think that. The meeting was set for the following afternoon at Cross's Detroit office, a suite on the 14th floor of a downtown building that had been renovated 2 years prior, all glass and pale wood, the kind of space designed to tell you something about the person who occupied it before they said a word. Darius drove there in the F-150, which he parked in the building's underground garage next to a row of vehicles that cost more than most people's annual salary, and which he felt no particular need to apologize for. He wore his work clothes, not because he'd forgotten to change, because he'd decided not to. Diane had argued against the meeting twice more, and then, recognizing the particular quality of Darius's silence when he'd made a decision, had shifted to preparation instead. She'd given him 3 pages of notes on what to say and what not to say, and he'd read them carefully and agreed with most of it. Marcus had offered to come. "No," Darius had said. "Why not?" "Because I need him to think this is manageable. 2 of us makes it look like a confrontation." "It is a confrontation." "Yes, but he doesn't need to know that until it's already over." He took the elevator to the 14th floor and was met by a receptionist who offered him water or coffee with the professional warmth of someone who'd been trained to make all visitors feel equally welcome, regardless of how they arrived. He took the coffee and waited 7 minutes, Cross's way of establishing something, or simply a man who ran 7 minutes behind. Darius couldn't be sure which. Then the door opened and Adrian Cross walked out. He was what Darius had expected from the photographs. Tall, well-dressed, the kind of confident that looked native rather than performed. He had the handshake of a man who'd learned early that first impressions were a resource. He smiled warmly. "Darius, thanks for coming in. I appreciate you reaching out directly, rather than letting the lawyers take over." "Sure," Darius said. He followed Cross into the office. Glass on 2 sides, a view of the city below. Framed architectural renderings on the walls. Projects completed or in progress, each one labeled with a neighborhood name and a year. Darius glanced at them without being obvious about it. 2 of the neighborhoods shown were in Detroit. One of the renderings showed a building he recognized. It was 2 blocks from the East Warren location. They sat. Cross had his own coffee. He settled into his chair with the ease of a man on his own ground. "I understand there's been some confusion with the authorization document," Cross began. "I want you to know that was never intended to create any issue for Celeste. The way it was presented to her was—" "Adrian," Darius said. Cross stopped. "I have the original version of the document. I have the modified version. I have the metadata showing when the modification was made and by whom. I have Nadia Mercer's statement describing the document management process." Darius set his coffee down. "I also have the internal memo, all 4 pages, that describes your acquisition strategy for what your company calls the Monroe Cluster, including the section about utilizing your relationship with CM as access to my properties." Something moved through Cross's face. It wasn't quite fear. It was the look of a man rapidly recalculating, moving pieces around a board that had just changed configuration. "Nadia," he said. Not a question. "She's not the point," Darius said. "The point is that First Midwest Commercial has been notified that the authorization document was fraudulently executed. The lender has put the preliminary file on hold. When they run a proper review of the collateral on your Bridgepoint loan, they're going to find that 2 of the 3 properties you pledged have prior encumbrances that disqualify them." Cross was quiet. He'd set down his coffee. His hands were flat on the desk, which was the tell. Darius had learned to watch hands in the course of a lifetime of dealing with people, and flat hands on a flat surface meant someone who'd lost the thing they'd been holding on to. "What do you want?" Cross said. "I want you to understand something first." Darius leaned forward slightly. "You came into my city. You identified properties that 3 generations of my family built. You used my wife, who did not understand what you were doing, to get access to information and documents that you then used to try to acquire what I built." He paused. "And you did all of that because you looked at me and decided I was someone who wouldn't notice." Cross said nothing. "I noticed," Darius said. A long silence. Outside the glass, Detroit spread out below them. Its scars and its construction cranes, its empty lots and its new buildings, its rivers and its rail lines and its neighborhoods that had been written off and had refused to stay written off. "The fraud claim," Cross said, and his voice had changed, the warmth gone, something more careful underneath it. "If this goes formal, it's complicated. Authorization documents. The comparison of the 2 versions is not complicated," Darius said. "Diane Okafor is a very precise attorney. She will make it simple." Cross looked at him for a moment. "What are you offering?" "I'm not offering anything. I'm explaining what happens next." Darius picked up his coffee again. You withdraw from any pending transaction related to Monroe Motorworks properties. You withdraw the Bridgepoint loan application as it currently stands, before Bridgepoint discovers the collateral issues independently, which would be worse for you. You provide a written statement that the authorization document was submitted in error and that no valid authorization existed. He paused. In exchange, I do not immediately pursue the fraud claim through civil litigation. You get to manage your exit from this situation without a lawsuit on the public record. That's not... Cross stopped, started again. That's a significant ask. It's the only ask, Darius said. The alternative is that Diane files the civil complaint tomorrow morning, Bridgepoint gets notified simultaneously, and your investors find out about the collateral problem the way investors generally prefer not to find things out, through a court filing. Cross looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the way he'd looked at him when Darius walked in, with the polished assessment of someone who'd already categorized what he was dealing with. This was different. This was a man looking at something he hadn't fully seen before. You've been planning this for a while, Cross said. I've been paying attention, Darius said. There's a difference. Cross's attorney called Diane at 9 the following morning. The conversation, as Diane described it to Darius afterward, was brief and businesslike. Cross Holdings Group was withdrawing from any pending transaction involving Monroe Motorworks properties. A corrective statement regarding the authorization document would be provided within 48 hours. There was no admission of liability in the communication. Diane had expected that, but the withdrawal was unambiguous and documented. Darius was at the Gratiot location when she called him with the news. He was in the middle of helping one of the techs diagnose a transmission issue. Not because he needed to, but because Gloria was short-staffed, and because Darius Monroe had never been the kind of owner who watched other people work if he could be useful. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and listened to Diane. It's done, he said. The withdrawal is done. The litigation question remains open. We haven't formally agreed not to pursue the fraud claim, and I wouldn't recommend closing that door completely. We'll leave it dormant unless he moves against anything else. Understood. What about the Bridgepoint loan? That's his problem now. When they run the collateral review, and they will because they'd be negligent not to, they'll find the issues. How he handles that is between him and them. A pause. Darius, without the Monroe properties as the acquisition target, and with the collateral questions on the loan, his financing structure doesn't hold. This thing falls apart on its own. Darius stood in the middle of the service bay. Around him, the shop went on. The lift rising with a sedan that needed its brake lines replaced, the radio playing something with a heavy bass line. The particular ambient noise of work being done by people who knew what they were doing. Okay, he said. That's it? Okay. What do you want me to say, Diane? Something more than okay after 3 weeks of this. He almost smiled. The work's not done yet. The legal part is largely done. That's not what I mean. He meant the other part, the part that didn't have a filing deadline or a court date. The part that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the morning Celeste had slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table and said, "You've got the shop," like it was a consolation. The Bridgepoint situation resolved itself with the particular efficiency of financial systems when they discover they've been misled. A compliance officer contacted Diane's office 3 days later, seeking information about the Monroe property titles in connection with their loan review. Diane provided everything. The collateral issues, 2 properties with prior pledges that Cross had apparently believed would go undetected, were confirmed within the week. Bridgepoint froze the loan. Without the loan, Cross's acquisition plan had no capital. Without the acquisition plan, his Detroit operation had no forward momentum. The investors he'd brought in for the Monroe cluster deal began making calls. 2 of them retained attorneys of their own. Marcus tracked most of this through his network. The city's commercial real estate layer was, as Darius had always known, smaller than it appeared from outside, and word moved through it quickly. He called Darius on a Thursday evening with an update. His Chicago office laid off 3 people this week, Marcus said. The Detroit operation is basically on pause. 2 of the investors are demanding return of their committed capital. He'll fight that. He'll try. But his attorney is billing him by the hour, and his CFO has provided sworn testimony in a related matter, so his legal strategy is going to get expensive fast. Darius was in the kitchen. He'd made dinner, Actual dinner, not takeout, for the first time in 2 weeks. Nothing elaborate. Chicken, rice, the kind of meal that didn't require much thinking but required enough attention to occupy his hands. "Marcus," he said. "Yeah. How are the shops?" A pause. "Good. Better than good, actually. East Warren had its best month since we opened. Gloria's team? All intact. Nobody left." Marcus paused again. The two techs cross-approached. They both turned him down, by the way. I talked to both of them. They said they didn't like the way the conversation felt. Darius was quiet for a moment. That mattered to him more than he expected it to. "Okay," he said. "Good. What are you making? It smells like something." Darius looked at the phone. "How would you know what it smells like?" "I'm pulling up in front of your house. I figured you hadn't eaten." He shook his head and went to unlock the front door. They ate at the kitchen table where the 7 keys had been, where the divorce papers had been, where he'd laid out the truth about the business to the woman he'd been married to for 15 years. The table that had held all of it. Marcus ate with the appetite of someone who'd had a long day and didn't try to have a significant conversation while he was doing it, which was another of his better qualities. Afterward, they sat with coffee, and Marcus said, "The divorce. Where does that stand?" "Lawyers are talking. Celeste's attorney reached out to Diane about the fraud matter. They want to coordinate the documentation to make sure Celeste's role is clearly characterized as a victim of the deception," which it was. "You're protecting her?" "I'm making sure the record is accurate." He wrapped his hands around the mug. "She didn't know what she was signing. That's true. It needs to be part of the record because if it isn't, it could follow her." Marcus looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know. Most people wouldn't. Most people maybe didn't spend 15 years with her." He looked at the table. "She made choices that broke things between us. But she didn't commit fraud. Those are different things." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't push it further. He knew when Darius had finished with the subject. They sat for a while in the kitchen with their coffee going cold, 2 men in their 40s in a house that was half empty and would soon be something else entirely. And outside Detroit was doing what it always did in the winter, enduring, without fanfare, with the plain stubbornness of a place that had learned not to wait for someone to save it. Darius thought about the 7 keys still in the envelope in the hallway closet. He thought about the East Warren property, the adjacent parcels he'd bought when no one wanted them, the block that had started to come back because a garage had opened, and people had seen that someone believed in it enough to stay. He thought about the storage building on the far end of the East Warren lot, the one he'd bought in 2019 along with the main building, that he'd been using for overflow inventory, that was larger than he needed for that purpose, and had been nagging at him for 3 years as something he hadn't figured out yet. He thought about what Adrian Cross had wanted to do with that land, and he thought about what he wanted to do with it instead. The idea that had been forming for weeks, quietly, in the background, the way all his best decisions formed, had become specific enough now that it had edges. He could see what it was. He didn't say it out loud yet. Not to Marcus. Not to anyone. He'd learned, over a lifetime, that some things needed to be carried privately for a while before they were ready for the world. That wasn't secrecy. It was the patience of knowing that a decision worth making was worth making right. He picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in February, which was not a day that felt significant in any outward way. Detroit in February was the same as Detroit in January. Gray, cold, the kind of weather that didn't dress itself up. Darius drove to Diane's office, signed what needed to be signed, shook hands with the people in the room, and drove back to the East Warren shop in the F-150 with the heat on full and an oldies station playing something from the 70s that he didn't know the name of but recognized anyway. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. 15 years. Not a small thing. Not something you process in a parking lot on a Wednesday in February. But there was no weight lifting from his shoulders, no sudden lightness. That was not how it worked, in his experience, when something real ended. The weight didn't go anywhere immediately. It just changed its shape, became something you carried differently, rather than something that was gone. He went inside. Gloria had coffee made. She didn't say anything about where he'd been. She handed him a cup and told him the afternoon schedule, and he nodded and got on with the day. That was the right thing. Getting on with the day. The settlement had been, as Diane put it, fair. The Monroe Motorworks properties and business were uncontested. There had been no plausible argument that Celeste had a claim to assets held entirely in Darius's business entities, particularly given the circumstances of the preceding months. The house was sold, the proceeds split. Celeste kept the furniture she'd chosen, the car she drove, a savings account that was jointly held. Darius kept everything else, which was considerably more, and he did not feel the need to make that fact into anything. What he had been clear about from the beginning was that the documentation in the case established Celeste's role precisely. She had been deceived. The consent form she'd signed had been materially altered without her knowledge. Her attorney had worked alongside Diane to ensure this characterization was unambiguous in the record, not because Celeste deserved special protection from consequences, but because the consequence she'd have faced without that clarity was one she hadn't actually earned. He'd had one conversation with Celeste directly about this, in the final weeks before the filing was complete. It was brief. She'd called him, not her attorney, which told him the formality of the process had started to feel like the wrong container for what she needed to say. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The documentation, making sure my name was clean." "The record should be accurate," he said. "That's not why you did it." He was quiet for a moment. "No, not entirely." She didn't ask him to explain further. He didn't offer to. There were some things between people who had known each other for a long time that didn't require elaboration, that were understood at the level where words were more likely to diminish than clarify. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said about the shop. You've got the shop. Like it was nothing. You didn't know what it was. I didn't try to know. That's different." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "It is." "Is this business okay?" "It's fine. Better than fine." "Good." A pause. "I mean that, Darius. I genuinely mean that." He believed her. That was the complicated truth about the end of their marriage. Not that she had never cared about him, but that caring and seeing had become different things at some point, and she'd cared without seeing for long enough that the gap had become too wide to close. He wasn't entirely innocent in that. He'd made choices that kept him invisible. He decided what she was capable of understanding and acted accordingly, which was its own kind of condescension dressed up as protection. They had made each other smaller in different ways. That was the honest accounting of it. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," she said. He set the phone down and sat in the quiet of the East Warren back office for a while, in the institutional carpet and the slightly out-of-date whiteboard and the particle board desk, and he let the silence be what it was. Adrian Cross's financial collapse did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way structural failures happen, incrementally, each piece loading pressure onto the next, until the whole thing became impossible to hold. Bridgepoint Capital called the loan within 3 weeks of freezing it, citing the collateral misrepresentation. The recovery proceedings were quiet at first, these things usually were, but 2 of Cross's investors filed suit, which made it not quiet. The suits were civil, not criminal, but the documentation Nadia Mercer had provided became part of the civil record, and civil records are public. Darius did not follow the proceedings closely. He asked Diane to keep him informed of anything that directly affected Monroe Motorworks or required his response, and otherwise he let it move at its own pace. He wasn't interested in watching the collapse itself. He'd seen enough of what it was built on to know how it would end. What he was told over the following months was this. Cross Holdings Group surrendered its Detroit office lease in March. Adrian Cross personally filed for a restructuring of his liabilities in April, which was not quite bankruptcy but was adjacent to it. The Chicago operation was reduced to a skeleton staff by summer. The architectural renderings in his 14th floor office, the ones labeled with neighborhood names and optimistic years, were presumably taken down, though Darius had no way of knowing for certain and didn't spend time imagining it. Nadia Mercer cooperated fully with both the civil proceedings and a separate regulatory inquiry that emerged from the Bridgepoint situation. She retained her own attorney early and secured an arrangement that held her liable for the filings she'd signed but protected her from the fraud claims that attached to Cross personally. She lost her equity stake and a significant portion of the prior year's compensation she'd been counting on. She did not, as far as Darius knew, complain about it publicly. He thought about her occasionally. Her flat statement at the beginning of their meeting that she wasn't doing it because she was a good person. He'd found, in the months since, that he respected that honesty more the longer he sat with it. The world was full of people who did the right thing for complicated reasons, and demanding that they do it for pure ones was a way of ensuring fewer right things got done. Marcus had his own read on the whole situation, expressed over lunch at the Coney Island on McNichols about 6 months after the divorce was finalized. The thing about Cross, Marcus said, working through a plate of eggs that had no business being ordered at 1 in the afternoon, is that he never actually understood what he was dealing with. He looked at the Monroe properties and saw undervalued assets in transitional neighborhoods. He looked at you and saw someone who didn't know what he had. A lot of people make that read, Darius said. Yeah, but most of them aren't trying to steal it from you. Darius turned his coffee cup in his hands. He wasn't entirely wrong about the undervalued part. The properties were worth more than most people realized. Because you made them worth more. Because the neighborhoods came back. We were part of that, but we weren't all of it. Marcus pointed at him with a fork. See, that right there. That's the thing. You've never been able to just say, I built something valuable and I protected it. You always have to distribute the credit. Distributing credit isn't the same as not taking it. Sometimes it is. Darius looked at him. My grandfather never put his name on anything except the sign. And the sign said Monroe, Marcus said. That's still a name. He'd broken ground on the Monroe Skills Lab in late March, 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. The storage building on the East Warren lot, the one Adrian Cross had described in his internal memo as a high-priority redevelopment parcel, the one that had been sitting in Darius's mind as an unresolved thing for 3 years, was gutted over the course of 4 weeks by a crew that Darius hired from the neighborhood, specifically and on purpose. The building's bones were good. His grandfather would have said that about it. Good bones, meaning the structure was worth preserving, worth working with rather than tearing down. He brought in a contractor named Sylvia Drummond, who had grown up 6 blocks from the East Warren shop and had her own small construction firm that had been doing renovation work in the neighborhood for 8 years. She walked the building with him twice before she said anything substantive, which he appreciated. What do you want it to do? She asked on the second walkthrough. Training space. Automotive technician training, primarily. Paid apprenticeships for people 18 to 25 who don't have a clear path into a trade. He walked to the far wall, which was brick and in good condition. Lifts over here, diagnostic stations along this wall. A classroom space in the back. Not a big one. The work is the point, not the lectures. Sylvia had her notepad out and was writing. How many apprentices at a time? 6 to start. Maybe 10 eventually. Small enough that each person actually gets attention. You're going to run it yourself? I'll be involved. We'll bring in a program director. The senior techs from the locations will rotate through as instructors. They'll get a stipend for it. He turned to face the space. The apprentices get paid. Not a lot, but enough to make it real. Enough that someone with actual obligations can participate. Sylvia stopped writing and looked at him. Why paid? Most programs like this run on volunteer hours and donated time. He thought about the question. It was a fair one, and it had an answer he'd been working on for a while. Because unpaid training is a middle-class luxury, he said. If you've got a family, if you're paying rent, if you're the person in your household that other people depend on, you can't spend 6 months not earning. You just can't. And those are exactly the people I want in the program. Sylvia held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to writing. Okay, she said, I can work with this. The renovation took 11 weeks, which was 2 weeks longer than planned because of a plumbing situation inside the wall that nobody had anticipated and that cost significantly more than the contingency budget had accounted for. Darius did not enjoy this, but he dealt with it without drama, which was the only productive way to deal with construction surprises. The Monroe Skills Lab opened in June. No ceremony, or rather, a small one. He'd resisted the idea of a ribbon cutting with photographers and speeches, because that wasn't the point and it wasn't his style. There was a lunch. The techs from all 7 locations were there, and their families, and some of the neighborhood business owners who'd watched the East Warren block change over the past few years. Marcus gave a short speech that was mostly jokes, and then one moment of genuine feeling that surprised everyone, including Marcus. Gloria said a few words. Darius said less. He said, the building used to hold spare parts. It's going to hold people now, which is a better use of the space. He said, my grandfather started this with used equipment and a reputation for doing the work right. We're going to do the same thing here. He said, "If any of the young people who come through this program end up running their own shop someday, that will be the whole point of it." Then he said that the coffee was in the back and he had to go check on something in the service bay, which was not entirely true, but which was a necessary exit from any situation that was starting to feel like a ceremony. The first cohort of apprentices started in September. There were 6 of them. Darius had reviewed all the applications himself, not because he didn't trust the process, but because he'd insisted on being involved in the selection, and he didn't believe in insisting on things and then delegating them. He read 22 applications and made notes on each one and sat with the program director, a woman named Keisha Bartlett, who had run workforce development programs for a decade and who had agreed to join Monroe Skills Lab after a single conversation that had gone 4 hours longer than either of them planned. The 6 they chose were not the 6 with the most experience or the cleanest records or the most polished applications. They were the 6 who had something specific, a clear reason why this mattered to them, and a demonstrated willingness to show up for hard things. Keisha had put it simply in one of their planning conversations. "I don't want people who need this to look good on a resume. I want people who need this to be able to stay in Detroit." Among the 6 was a 22-year-old named Malcolm Reed. Malcolm had grown up in the neighborhood, 3 miles from the East Warren shop. He'd been working part-time at a grocery warehouse for 2 years, saving money with no specific plan attached to the saving, trying to figure out something that felt like a direction. His application essay was 7 sentences long, which was the shortest one Darius had read, and it said, "I've been taking apart engines since I was 12 because my uncle showed me how, and it was the first thing I ever did that felt like I was actually thinking. I want to learn how to do it right. I want to be someone my neighborhood can call when something needs fixing." Darius had circled it without annotation, which was how he marked the ones he was certain about. Malcolm showed up on the first day in work clothes that were slightly too large for him and shook everyone's hand with the formality of someone who was nervous but committed to not appearing nervous. He had good hands. Darius noticed this early, the way a person's hands move when they're comfortable with tools versus when they're performing comfort. Malcolm's hands were comfortable. He also asked better questions than most. Not more questions, better ones. He would work through something until he hit a point he didn't understand, and then he'd ask precisely about that point rather than asking generally, or worse, not asking at all. The senior tech assigned to his station, a veteran named Terrence, who had been with the Gratiot location for 9 years and who was not given to easy praise, told Darius at the end of the 3rd week, "That kid's got it. He doesn't know it yet, but he's got it." Darius nodded. He'd seen it too. The program ran for 8 months. It was not 8 smooth months. 2 of the 6 apprentices hit personal crises during the program. One a family medical situation that required a month's leave. One a housing disruption that Keisha and Darius quietly addressed by connecting the apprentice with a community housing organization they'd already built a relationship with in anticipation of exactly this kind of thing. One apprentice washed out at month 3, not from lack of ability, but from a combination of outside circumstances that made showing up consistently impossible. Darius felt that one. He sat with Keisha afterward and talked about what could have been done differently, and they made changes to the support structure for the next cohort. The 5 who completed the program were offered positions. All 5 accepted. Malcolm Reed was assigned to the East Warren location under Gloria's supervision, which was the highest stakes placement Darius could have made and which he'd made deliberately. Gloria ran the best shop. She also had the least patience for people who coasted, which meant she had significant patience for people who didn't. 18 months after the program's first cohort graduated, Darius was standing in the East Warren service bay watching Malcolm work through a diagnostic on a late-model sedan with an electrical fault that had stumped 2 other techs before it came to his station. Malcolm was 23 now, a full year into his role, and he'd developed the particular focused economy of motion that good technicians develop when they've stopped performing the work and started actually doing it. He found the fault in 40 minutes. A corroded ground connection inside the door panel, causing intermittent power loss to the driver's side window, and cascading from that, a confused signal to the body control module. The kind of thing that looked like 3 different problems until you found the one thing causing all of them. He showed Darius without being asked, because he'd learned that Darius liked to see the work. "Here," Malcolm said, holding up the corroded terminal. "Everything else was reading off because of this." "How'd you narrow it to the door panel?" The BCM codes were inconsistent. They were changing between scans, which meant the module was reacting to something intermittent rather than something constant. So I went looking for intermittent connections instead of components. Darius turned the terminal over in his fingers. Good read. Malcolm nodded, not prideful, satisfied, the right version. They stood in the bay for a moment. Around them, the shop moved at its usual pace, the lift cycling, the radio doing its thing, the particular light of a Detroit afternoon in late fall coming through the high windows at an angle that made the whole space look like something worth painting. Mr. Monroe, Malcolm said. Yeah. I wanted to ask you something, and you can tell me it's not the right time. Darius looked at him. Ask. The new location, the one you're planning for the Brightmoor expansion. He paused. I heard you were looking for a location manager. I know I'm young. I know I've got a year in. But I want you to know I'm interested when the time is right. Darius was quiet for a moment. He looked at Malcolm, this 23-year-old who had written 7 sentences and shown up in slightly too large work clothes, and asked good questions and found corroded ground connections that other people missed. That's a conversation we can have, Darius said. Not today, but we can have it. Malcolm nodded. He went back to the sedan without additional comment, which was the right move. Darius walked back toward the office, and he stopped in the doorway and looked back at the bay, at the work being done, at the people doing it, at the building his family had poured 50 years of mornings into. He thought about what Marcus had said over eggs at the Coney Island. You've never been able to just say, I built something valuable and I protected it. He was working on that. Not the saying, woke, the believing. The actual internal understanding that what he'd done was worth what he'd given for it. It was taking longer than he'd expected, which was probably how it should take. The things that had not resolved cleanly, because most things don't. He still thought about Celeste sometimes. Not with longing, with something more like the complicated regard you have for a person who was genuinely important to your life and with whom things had genuinely gone wrong. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was doing well professionally, had taken a position with a firm in Chicago, had moved. He didn't know if she was happy. He hoped she was, in the functional way you hope for something you've stopped being responsible for. The marriage had been real. That was the thing he'd had to sit with and eventually accept as both true and insufficient. Something can be real and still not be enough. Something can be real and still, in the end, be wrong for both people involved. He'd spent too long, in the months after the divorce, trying to identify the moment it had turned, as if there were one moment, as if the thing had broken cleanly rather than worn through. It had worn through. That was the honest answer. Two people making small decisions every day that accumulated over time into a distance neither of them had intended. He did not carry the bitterness of it the way he'd half expected to. The attempt on the business, Cross, the documents, all of it, had purged something. Not because it had given him something clear to be angry at, though it had done that too, but because it had required him to be completely present in a way the last years of his marriage had not. It had required him to know exactly what he was defending and why. And in knowing that, something had clarified. He was 51 years old, and owned 7 Monroe Motor Works locations, and was in the planning stages of an 8th in Brightmoor, a neighborhood on the west side that was doing the same slow, stubborn thing East Warren had done, deciding to come back without asking anyone's permission. He ran a paid apprenticeship program that had completed 2 cohorts and was accepting applications for its 3rd. He drove a 1994 F-150 that he maintained himself and which had 280,000 miles on it and which he had no intention of replacing. He wore his work clothes. He drank black coffee in a styrofoam cup from the gas station on Fenkel. He showed up early. These things had not changed because nothing dramatic had happened to him. They had not changed because they were the things he was made of, and a man who abandons what he's made of to become something more impressive is a man who's been convinced that impressive is the same as substantial, which it is not. What had changed, what he was still in the middle of changing, was the hiding. He understood now, with the clarity that comes from having something threatened, that his silence about the business had never been purely humility. Some of it was humility. Some of it was the lesson from his grandfather, legitimate and well-learned. The business doesn't owe you anything, and the day you start using it to prove something is the day it starts to slip. But some of it, more than he'd acknowledged for a long time, had been fear. Fear that being seen clearly meant being assessed, and that assessment might find him wanting in ways that quiet anonymity protected him from. His wife had not known him. That was true, but he had not offered himself to be known. He had given her a partial picture and then felt unseen within it, which was not a fair arrangement to impose on another person, however unconsciously. He was working on that too, the willingness to be known. It was awkward and intermittent and sometimes felt more like exposure than like connection, but he kept at it in the way he kept at things that mattered, not with great sweeping gestures, but with daily small decisions in the right direction. On a Thursday in October, the second anniversary of Celeste, sliding the divorce papers across the kitchen table, Darius drove out to the Livernois location before sunrise. He parked the F-150 and sat in it for a moment, looking at the building. The Navy sign, the white letters. Monroe Motor Works. S. 1971. His grandfather's building, twice expanded, equipment entirely updated, staffed by people who knew what they were doing and came back every morning because the work was real and the pay was fair and there was something in the culture of the place that made it worth returning to. He got out of the truck. He walked to the front door and unlocked it with the original key, the owner's key, not the manager's copy, and went inside and turned on the lights. The shop smelled the way it had always smelled: oil, metal, the faint ghost of 1,000 engines. He'd grown up with this smell. He'd stopped noticing it for years, the way you stop noticing anything that's always been there, and then circumstances had made him notice it again. He walked the floor, checked the scheduling board, looked at the equipment the way his father had looked at equipment, not to find problems, but to maintain the habit of looking, to keep the place from becoming abstract. He thought about his grandfather in these same square feet, in 1971, in the early dark before anyone else arrived, making himself useful in his own shop. He thought about what Curtis Monroe had known that he hadn't been able to put into words beyond the one statement Darius had carried with him for 40 years. The day you start thinking the business owes you something, that's the day it starts dying. What he understood now, that he hadn't at 11, was the full shape of that lesson. It wasn't just about entitlement. It was about attention. It was about staying present to what you'd built, rather than using it as a platform to be somewhere else. It was about the difference between having a legacy and living one. A legacy isn't a plaque on a wall. It isn't a net worth figure or a number of locations or an article in a business journal. A legacy is what happens to the people who come through the thing you built, what they're able to do afterward that they couldn't do before. It's Malcolm Reed with his good hands and his 7-sentence essay, Finding the Corroded Ground Connection and knowing why that was where to look. It's the East Warren block with its bakery and its barbershop and its furniture maker and its garage. It's Terrence at the Gratiot location, 9 years in, training someone who might run a shop of their own one day. That's what Adrian Cross had been trying to take. Not the properties. The properties were just land and buildings. What he'd been trying to take was the continuation, the next part of the story. And the reason he'd failed wasn't ultimately because Darius had outmaneuvered him legally or exposed his fraud or presented him with a choice he couldn't refuse. The reason he'd failed was that the thing he was trying to acquire was too thoroughly inhabited to be extracted. It had people in it who'd turned down his offers without being asked to. It had 50 years of earned trust in the neighborhoods where it operated. It had roots. You can't buy roots. You can't forge a signature on them and file them with a lender. They either exist or they don't. The sun came up while Darius was standing in the middle of the Livernois service bay, which it did without ceremony, the way it always did. The cold October light coming through the high windows at the same angle it had been coming through for 53 years. He heard a car pull into the lot, then another. His people arriving for the early shift the way they arrived every morning, the way the mornings kept coming and the work kept being there to do. He went to start a pot of coffee. He was not a man who had been hidden and then revealed. He was not a man whose story was about being underestimated and then vindicated. Those were cleaner narratives than the truth, and the truth was that he was a man who had made real mistakes and learned from some of them too slowly, who had loved imperfectly and built imperfectly, and who was, at 51, still in the middle of figuring out how to be fully present in his own life. But he was here, he was paying attention, he was making the coffee and opening the doors and doing the work that his grandfather had shown him was the only work that actually mattered. That was enough. That had, it turned out, always been enough. The Gloria who had handed him coffee on the morning of his divorce finalization was the same Gloria who had been running the Livernois floor 11 years ago, when Darius had promoted her over two candidates with more formal credentials and less actual sense. She had never thanked him for it in any dramatic way. She wasn't that kind of person. But she'd run the location with the same undemonstrative competence that had made him choose her in the first place. And in 11 years, she had never once called him with a problem that she hadn't already half solved by the time he picked up. So when Gloria called him on a Friday afternoon in November and said she needed to talk to him about something, he paid attention. "It's not an emergency," she said, "but it's not nothing." He drove over after closing time. She was still there, as she usually was. Gloria's departure time was contingent on everything being right rather than on the clock reaching a particular number, which was one of the things that made her exceptional and one of the things that occasionally made him feel guilty about how much he leaned on her. She had a folder on the desk in the back office. She slid it toward him without preamble. 3 inquiries in the last 6 weeks, she said. Different names, different approaches. 1 phone call asking about the lease. 1 person who came in for an oil change and spent the whole time asking the tech questions about ownership structure. 1 letter, you'll see it in there, from an entity I don't recognize asking about development potential. Darius opened the folder. Read the letter. It was not Cross Holdings, that was over, and he knew it was over. This was a different name, a different letterhead, the same general shape of inquiry. "You think it's connected to Cross?" he asked. "I think Detroit is full of people who watch what other people try to do and then try to do a version of it themselves," Gloria said. "I think word got out that the Monroe properties were worth looking at, and now other people are looking." He set the folder down. "You've been paying attention." "I've always paid attention. I just didn't always have a reason to bring it to you." "You always have a reason to bring it to me." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for statements she disagreed with but wasn't going to argue about. He recognized it because she'd been making it at him for 11 years. "Gloria," he said, "anything that comes through any of the locations that feels like someone asking about the buildings or the land, I need to know. Not after you've dealt with it, when it happens." "I can do that." "And I need you to tell the other location managers the same thing. Frame it how you want, but I need eyes on this consistently." She nodded once, closed the folder, and slid it back toward herself. Then she said, "The program, the skills lab. How's the 3rd cohort looking?" The shift in topic was deliberate. She was telling him that the business conversation was concluded and she had something else on her mind. He followed her lead. "Applications close next week. Keisha thinks we'll have strong candidates." "I want to take on an apprentice at this location," Gloria said. "Next cohort. I've been thinking about it since the first one started. I want one here." He looked at her. "You've never asked for that before." "I'm asking now." "Why here, specifically?" She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was going to say something true rather than something convenient. "Because this is the original location. Because it should be part of this. Because—" She paused. "My nephew applied to the 2nd cohort. He didn't get in. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want it to seem like I was asking for something." "Was he a strong candidate?" "He's young. He wasn't ready. But he's going to apply again, and I want him to be here if he gets in. I want to be the one working with him." Darius thought about it. Gloria supervising her own nephew carried the obvious complications. The conflict of interest, the personal weight of it, the risk that it went wrong and cost them both something. He also thought about Terrence at Gratiot, 9 years in, training the next person. About what it meant for the knowledge to move through people who already had reason to care about the place. "When the application comes in," he said, "Keisha evaluates it the same as anyone else. If he gets in on the merits, he's assigned to this location, and you supervise him. And if he doesn't get in on the merits, then he doesn't get in." Gloria nodded. She'd expected that answer. She'd asked the question because she'd wanted to make sure the boundary was clear before she agreed to the arrangement. That was the kind of person she was. "Thank you," she said. He left the folder with her and drove back through the city as it moved into the particular rhythm of a Friday evening, restaurant lights coming on, traffic thickening, the streets doing their complicated negotiation between people trying to get somewhere and people who'd already arrived. He thought about the letter in the folder. A new name, a different letterhead, the same shape. But wasn't alarmed. He'd made his peace with the fact that the Monroe properties would always attract attention from people who understood what they were worth. The first time that attention had arrived attached to a plan to take what was his, he hadn't been paying close enough attention. He was paying attention now, and he intended to keep paying it, and the difference between those two positions was the difference between a business that continued and one that didn't. He called Marcus from the truck. "You hear anything about a company called—" He looked at the letter he'd photographed on his phone. "Read the name." "Nope," Marcus said. "You want me to look into it?" "Quietly, just background. No need to escalate unless something connects." "Got it." A pause. "How's Gloria?" "She's Gloria." "That's a full answer," Marcus said, and hung up. Keisha Bartlett had a habit of scheduling their planning meetings at 7 in the morning, which Darius appreciated because he was already up, and it meant they could finish before the day got complicated. She brought her own coffee and a yellow legal pad that she used in a way that suggested she'd been using yellow legal pads her entire professional life, which he found quietly comforting. They met in the back office at East Warren on the first Tuesday of every month. They'd been doing it since the program opened. The meetings ran between 45 minutes and 2 hours, depending on what needed addressing, and Darius had found them to be some of the most useful conversations he had, not because Keisha agreed with him, but because she didn't, consistently and specifically, in ways that improved his thinking. At the November meeting, she set her legal pad down after they'd gone through the operational items and said, "I want to talk about the alumni piece." "What about it?" "We have 14 program graduates now, 2 cohorts. They're all placed, most of them here in the Monroe locations. A couple went to other shops. But there's no structure for what happens next for them. No pathway, no continued investment, no way for them to stay connected to the program or to each other." Darius nodded slowly. "You're thinking about what happens when someone wants to move up." "I'm thinking about what happens when Malcolm Reed, 3 years from now, is ready for something bigger than a senior tech role. Or when one of the second cohort graduates decides she wants to run her own operation. Right now, they're on their own at that point. The program ends, and they're back to figuring it out without a structure." "What kind of structure are you proposing?" She turned to a page she'd already been writing on. "A graduate support network, annual gatherings, mentorship matching, the more advanced graduates working with newer cohorts, and a loan fund, small scale, for graduates who want to start their own businesses. Enough to make a real first step possible, not enough to do it for them." He looked at the notes. "The loan fund is the significant piece." "I know. It's also the piece that changes what the program actually is. Right now, it's a training program. With a loan fund, it becomes an ecosystem." He turned that word over. Ecosystem. It was the right word and he knew it, which was slightly irritating because it meant agreeing with something that was going to require significant additional work and capital. "How much are you thinking per loan?" 15 to 20,000, enough to lease space and equip a first bay. We do 3 to 5 loans a year once we have enough graduates to draw from." "Repayment structure?" "Below market interest rate, 5-year repayment. Some percentage of repaid principal goes back into the fund." She looked at him. "I've run the basics numbers. It's sustainable within 4 years if the first loans perform." He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window. The East Warren block in November. The bakery owner flipping the sign on her door. A woman walking a dog that appeared to be mostly legs and ambition. "Okay," he said. Keisha looked at him. "Okay, you'll think about it, or okay, we're doing it?" "Okay, we're doing it. Work up a full proposal and bring it to the next meeting. I want the repayment structure tightened, and I want a clear accountability mechanism for the loans before we formalize anything." She wrote something on her legal pad. He suspected it said something close to, "He said yes faster than expected." He didn't ask. "One more thing," she said. "Say it." "The program needs a name that isn't Monroe Skills Lab." He looked at her. "The program is called Monroe Skills Lab." "I know what it's called. I'm telling you it should have a different name or a subtitle, something that belongs to the graduates, not just to the building or the family name." He opened his mouth and then closed it, because he'd been about to say something reflexive and she deserved a considered response. He thought about it. "What are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing a specific name. I'm proposing that the graduates choose it. Second and first cohort together. Let them name the graduate network, at minimum. Let the program have something that came from the people who went through it." He thought about Curtis Monroe, whose name was on the sign, who had never put his name on anything else. He thought about what Marcus had said. The sign said Monroe, that's still a name, and the half agreement he'd offered in response. Set it up, he said. The graduates choose the network name. We keep Monroe Skills Lab for the program itself. Keisha nodded. She wrote something else. This time he was fairly sure it said Progress. Malcolm Reed got the location manager job. Not at Brightmoor. That was still 18 months away from opening, and Malcolm understood when Darius sat down with him in January and had the conversation properly, that the timeline had conditions, and that he was one of the conditions, but not the only one. What Darius offered him in the interim was a formal development track, a structured set of responsibilities, scheduling, vendor relations, floor supervision during Gloria's days off, that would build the specific competencies a location manager needed, a salary adjustment that reflected the additional weight, monthly check-ins with Darius directly. This isn't a guarantee, Darius told him. If the Brightmoor timeline moves, if the circumstances change, if someone else emerges who's more ready, those things can happen. I'm not promising you the job. I'm promising you the path. Malcolm had considered that for a moment. He was 23 years old, and he was being offered something real by someone who was being honest about what it was and what it wasn't. That's fair, he said. It's all I know how to do, Darius said. Make fair agreements and keep them. Malcolm nodded. Then he said, Why me? There are people here with more time in. It was a good question. It deserved an honest answer. Because you think about why things work, not just that they work. A location manager who can only follow a process is useful. A location manager who understands why the process exists can fix it when it breaks. He paused. You found that ground fault because you thought about what kind of problem could produce that pattern. That's not a technical skill. That's a thinking skill. It transfers. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My uncle used to say that about engines. He said if you understand why it's designed the way it is, you already know half of what's wrong with it. Your uncle was right. He died when I was 16. He never got to finish teaching me. Darius held that for a moment. He thought about his grandfather, who had died before Darius had learned everything he'd needed to learn, and about the particular grief of that, not just losing someone, but losing the continued knowledge they carried. The program exists partly because of people like your uncle, he said, people who knew things that didn't get passed on far enough. Malcolm nodded slowly. Outside the office window, the East Warren shop was running at full morning capacity, the lifts up, the work ongoing. I'll do the job right, Malcolm said. I know, Darius said. That's why we're having this conversation. By the time the third cohort's applications closed, Gloria's nephew had reapplied. His name was Deshaun, he was 20 years old, and his application was 8 pages long, which was the longest one Keisha had received. Keisha read it and called Darius and said, Either this kid is genuinely ready, or he's learned how to perform readiness very convincingly. Either way, I want to interview him. He got in. He was assigned to Livernois. Gloria supervised him with the particular combination of high expectation and zero tolerance for excuses that she applied to everything, and if she went slightly easier on him in the first 2 weeks, neither of them mentioned it, and Deshaun seemed to understand that the grace period was exactly that, a period, not a policy. At the end of month 2, Terrence drove over from Gratiot to cover a staffing gap for 3 days, worked alongside Deshaun for part of that time, and reported back to Darius in the characteristically economical way Terrence reported things. He's going to be fine. Darius filed that away and went back to the thing he was working on, which was a proposal for the Brightmoor expansion that he'd been refining for 6 months, and that involved, among other things, a partnership with a community land trust that would allow the building to serve multiple functions. Service bays on the ground floor, a second Monroe Skills Lab cohort space on the upper level, and a small commercial kitchen that a local food business incubator had expressed interest in leasing. It was more complicated than anything he'd undertaken before. It had more moving parts, more stakeholders, more ways for something to go sideways. Diane had reviewed the partnership agreements twice and had identified 4 issues that needed restructuring before she'd let him sign anything. He was comfortable with complicated. He'd learned over the course of the past 2 years that his instinct to simplify, to keep the business clean and contained and legible, had served him well in some ways and had limited him in others. The East Warren block had come back because things were complicated in the right ways. Because different kinds of people and businesses had made adjacent decisions that created something no single decision could have created alone. He was trying to do that more deliberately now, not manufacturing complexity for its own sake, but being willing to enter into it when the potential was real. Sylvia Drummond, who had renovated the Skills Lab building, was in discussions to be the general contractor for Brightmoor. She'd driven the site with him twice, asked the same question she'd asked at East Warren, "What do you want it to do?" and listened to the longer, more complicated answer with the same focused attention she'd brought to the shorter one. "It's going to take longer than East Warren," she said on the second walkthrough. "I know. And the community land trust piece adds a layer of approval process that's going to try your patience. I've dealt with worse." She looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "I know you have." She'd followed the Cross situation at a distance. It had not been a secret, and Detroit talked. "How are you going to manage the political piece? The land trust has 3 board members who are going to have opinions about a private business being the anchor tenant. I'm going to tell them the truth about what the program is and let them decide." He looked at the building, the bones of it, the particular quality of light coming through the industrial windows. "If they don't want us here after hearing the honest version, then this isn't the right partnership." Sylvia nodded. "Simple approach. It's the only one I know how to sustain." She made a note on her pad. Then she looked up. "My younger brother is going to apply to the 4th cohort," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know, not because I'm asking for anything." "How old is he?" 24. "He's been doing general labor construction for 3 years. He knows tools, but he doesn't know systems." "Tell him to apply," Darius said. "The rest is up to Keisha." Sylvia nodded, and they went back to walking the building, and the afternoon moved through the Brightmoor sky at its own pace, indifferent and sufficient, the way time moved in a city that had learned to work with what it had. There is a particular thing that happens to men who build something real and survive the attempt to take it from them. It is not the thing the stories usually describe, the triumphant reclaiming, the vindicated walk back into the kingdom with everyone watching. That version is cleaner than the actual experience, which is more like returning to a house after a long storm and finding that most of it is intact, but the work of checking every room, every foundation, every place where water might have gotten in, is its own sustained labor. Darius Monroe was in the middle of that labor. He expected to stay in the middle of it indefinitely, because the alternative, deciding the work was done and the thing was secured and you could stop paying attention, was precisely what had made him vulnerable in the first place. He wore his work clothes. He drank black coffee. He drove the F-150. These were not affectations or deliberate statements about who he was. They were simply the things that were true about him, and he had learned, at some cost, the difference between being true and performing truth. He no longer hid what the business was. Not with strangers, not with people he was building relationships with, not with the apprentices who came through the program and needed to understand what kind of institution they'd entered. He talked about the history, Curtis in 1971, Raymond in the slow years, the expansion decisions that had felt like risks at the time and had turned out to be the right ones. He talked about what the properties were worth and what that meant in terms of responsibility to the neighborhoods where they operated. He talked about failure, including his own, because a program designed to prepare young people for real work had no business pretending that real work didn't include failure. When Malcolm Reed, 6 months into his development track, made a scheduling error that left the East Warren location short-staffed on a Saturday. A genuine mistake, not a character failure, but with real operational consequences. Darius sat down with him afterward and did not soften the feedback beyond what was warranted. He also did not amplify it beyond what was warranted. "You made an assumption instead of checking," Darius said. "In scheduling, assumptions compound. One wrong assumption means 3 people are covering work that 5 people should be doing." "I know," Malcolm said. "I caught it too late." "What would you do differently?" Malcolm told him, specifically. He'd already thought it through before the meeting, which Darius had expected, and which was why the conversation was instructive rather than punitive. "That's right," Darius said. "Do it that way next time." "That's it?" "What else should there be?" Malcolm considered. "I expected, I don't know, more." "The expectation that mistakes require significant suffering before they're over is not useful," Darius said. "Understand what went wrong, adjust, Move forward. That's the whole process. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. My last job, if you made a mistake like that, the manager made it into a whole thing, talked about it for weeks. That's about the manager, not the mistake. Malcolm looked at him. Something settled in his face. A small adjustment, the kind that doesn't show dramatically, but that marks a shift in understanding. My uncle used to say something like that, he said. He said some people use other people's mistakes to make themselves feel bigger. Your uncle was right about a lot of things. Yeah, Malcolm said, and there was something in the single word that carried the full weight of a person who'd lost a teacher too early and had been trying to find the rest of the lesson ever since. He was. Darius left him to it. He walked back through the service bay, past the lift and the diagnostic stations and the wall where the apprentice stations had been set up, past the door that led out to the lot where the storage building had been transformed into a space where knowledge moved from one set of hands to another. His grandfather had done this. His father had done this. He was doing it. Malcolm Reed and Deshawn and the others who had come through and would come through were doing it in their own way, at the beginning of their own version of this story. That was the legacy. Not the buildings. The buildings were just containers. The legacy was this: the knowledge moving forward, the work continuing, the next person understanding something they hadn't understood before and being able to do something with it. Curtis Monroe had opened a garage in 1971 because he was good at the work and believed the work was worth doing. Everything since then, every expansion, every property, every decision that had accumulated into something worth protecting, had grown from that original ordinary fact. Darius walked out to the lot and stood for a moment in the November air. Cold, clear, the sky doing something complicated with the late afternoon light. Detroit around him, doing what it did, persisting, rebuilding, making something from what remained. He put his hands in his pockets and stood in it for a while, in the life he'd built and was still building, and found that it was enough. And that enough, honestly understood, was not a small thing. It was in fact everything.